Hey, Steve here, and in this video we're going to be discussing 3 of the most common exposure blending mistakes that I see photographers making in Photoshop. Now, they're the kind of mistakes that a non-photographer probably wouldn't notice right away, but their subconscious leaves them maybe feeling like something just doesn't feel right about an image. To you and me as photographers, when we can spot these mistakes and we instantly know why it doesn't feel right, then you'll be able to see the missed potential in so many images that do contain these mistakes. Now, after you watch this video, you might like to follow up with some of my previous videos that go into a lot more depth on how to blend exposures accurately and naturally. I'll put links to those in the description below. And if you want to get started with luminosity masking, which gives you all the tools that you need to eliminate these mistakes entirely from your workflow, then I'll put a link to that in the description as well, where you can download a free copy of my introduction to luminosity masking. Right, let's talk about these mistakes. Now, the first one is what I call over-blending. And it's what happens when you get an image. So just as a bit of background, I've got 3 exposures here loaded as layers in Photoshop: dark, middle, and light. And so over-blending, and I will exaggerate the effect here just so that you can see exactly what I'm referring to, is when you get an image and you've got all this beautiful color in the sky. You know, obviously, I mean, we've got the sky, we've got the sun literally in the frame, so we know this image should be very, very bright. The sky is probably bursting with color, and we see it with our naked eye, and you know, it just looks amazing. Our eyes can capture more dynamic range than our cameras can. So, you know, the temptation that I see a lot of people succumbing to is wanting to keep all of this dark, beautiful, natural color from their dark exposure, while also blending the bright exposure in like fully, so that we've got a really, really bright foreground and a really, really dark sky. And so that might look something like this. So let's add a layer mask to this top layer. Let's grab a black brush and let's just brush this in, just pretty roughly, but just so that you can see what I'm talking about really. So, you know, they'll blend a really, really bright foreground in with a really, really dark sky. And, you know, as you can see, we've, you know, got the nice detail. We can see the detail in the foreground. That's great. We've got this nice sky. That's great also, but together they just don't work. You know, it just doesn't make sense that the sky and the clouds would be that dark when the foreground is this bright. So I have exaggerated the effect here, but, you know, to prevent this happening for you, it's not so much a specific technique that you need to use. It's just to be aware that, you know, it doesn't make sense for a sky to be so dark when a foreground is so bright. So, you know, that's more of a sort of concept-based tip for you there. Now, the next one is a technique issue, and it's one that drives me crazy because I don't know how it goes so undetected. So basically what I'm talking about, the second mistake, is creating halos when you're blending. So I'll use this same example here. Actually, let me make this a little bit more realistic. So we'll use this this middle exposure here, and we'll try and blend the brighter cliffs over here in the distance. We'll try and blend those in from this exposure into this one. So let's zoom in on this area up here. Let's add a layer mask to this middle layer. And the reason halos are created is because people are using a brush. And again, I'll exaggerate the effect here so you can see it, but you know, it does exist even if it's less obvious. So let's take a black brush and mask into the cliffs here to brighten them up. That looks great. You know, let's get all the way to the edge of the cliff there so that we make sure we brighten the whole thing up. All the way down here. So, you know, we've blended the cliffs from that exposure beneath the dark one. So here we've blended that in with the darker exposure here, so the color in the sky is a lot better and looks better than in this bright exposure. But you can probably already see, because we're using just a regular brush and, you know, we're going up to the edges as close as we can, it's virtually impossible to stay within the confines of the edge of the cliffs in this example. Whatever the object is that you're blending around, the same thing applies. And so halos are when you're blending that brighter exposure in and going over the edges of what you should be blending. So it just looks like these objects here are glowing. Obviously down here it's a lot worse where I've exaggerated it. But when you're zoomed out, you can kind of see it's got this kind of glowing edge, and so that's why it's called a halo. So that's the next mistake, is creating blending halos. Now the third and final mistake, which is just as bad, is what I call toasting the tops of whatever objects it is that you're trying to blend and brush around in the layer mask. And basically it's the opposite of creating halos. So it's what happens when you are aware that you don't want to create halos, so you don't go all the way up to the edge. So let's do that, and I'll show you what that looks like. So let's stay well within the bounds of the cliffs. Now this one is a little less obvious to the layperson, but it's still, it drives me crazy when I see images like this and the exposure blending has been done in such a way that you've taken care to not go up to the edge and not create those halos. But what you're left with, and no matter how small you make this brush and how close, I'm already zoomed in at 200% here. I could even go, let's go to 400. I'm never going to get up close enough to that edge that I can brush it in fully without creating a halo. So what we're left with is basically dark edges to the objects that we're masking in or out of a particular layer. So definitely worth repeating that I'm exaggerating the effect here, but when you look at images that you see online, or perhaps some of your own older images, if you're not if you've not been using luminosity masking to do your exposure blending, then you may notice this in a slightly more subtle form. And really, the answer is to just use better and more accurate methods of blending exposures. So, like I said, if you want to actually start looking at how to use those more accurate methods, I've got a bunch of YouTube videos that I'll link to in the description that will get you started with luminosity masking. I've also got a free guide that you can download that will get you started with luminosity masking as well. And I'll put a link to that in the description. So what I really wanted from this video is to show you some of the mistakes that I see people making, so that you can take them on board and not make these yourself. And hopefully with the videos that I provide in the description, you got everything you need to really start creating some nice, natural, well-blended exposures in Photoshop. So with that said, I hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments, and I'll talk to you soon.